missing.
Welcome back to the podcast. Chloe Canter, how are you today?
Happy to be back on the pod. That one was not going away. I am so happy to be here. So happy to catch up with my old friends.
And it is a welcome thing in my ears to hear those words again. And we've been saying those words more often. Welcome back to the show, Chloe Canter. I cannot wait to continue that tradition as long as possible. I cannot wait for this conversation. What are you bringing to the table today?
I too love being back, and today I am here to present a true crime story that is Halloween themed or Halloween centered. That was my assignment, and hopefully it's one that you two are unfamiliar with, that I can break down. Everyone's learning about it at the same time, perhaps. You all can give your input, ask your questions. It should be a fun talk.
That's right. We are in the thick of the Halloween season. We asked you to come up with something that had that theme to it, and what you're about to present to us, as far as I know, Tim and I are not aware of it.
The case originates back to 1975, but it still pops up in the headlines and it has relevance to this day. So I think you might have heard of it, or at least it might start ringing bells the longer we talk about it.
My high school senior prom.
No.
So what do you got for us, Chloe? What is the story?
Okay, so we're in 1975, right? Just earlier that year, a girl moves to Greenwich, Connecticut with her family. She has an older brother, and her parents are together. Her dad is a very wealthy executive. Her mom stays home. She was a California girl, came to Connecticut, blonde hair, super cute, won the superlative, at the end of the year, the yearbook votes, the student body votes, and she won the most popular girl in school after being the new girl. So by all accounts, she was a beloved member, albeit new, a beloved member of this very wealthy community. Not only is Greenwich super rich in general, but she lived in the richest neighborhood in Greenwich called Bellhaven. And this is a coastal community. It's gated, and they have a golf course, which, people get married at. And it was just as fancy back in 1975 as it is today. In fact, the neighbors across the street were Kennedys, or at least cousins of the Kennedy family. And those were the kinds of people that she rolled with in Greenwich.
Okay, Tim, is it ringing any bells for you?
No, I am not familiar at this point.
But I do like the setup. I do like 1975. I do like the New England theme with it being Connecticut. So I'm getting some foliage in my head. I'm getting some chill in the air.
Definitely. Very leafy, very crisp. It was starting to, freeze overnight. It was mischief night. So I believe different parts of the country call it different things. I don't know what the other terms for it are, but it's the night before Halloween, and people get into trouble, usually kids, and it's usually harmless fun, shaving cream, toilet paper rolls on trees. And so kids in the neighborhood would all go out and mess around. I know I did. I don't know if that was something in your social circles when you guys were kids and teens.
Oh yeah, we would fire some eggs at each other. Oh yeah.
So it's supposed to be all innocent fun and games. This girl that I'm talking about, her name is Martha, and she actually is in trouble with her mom for breaking curfew. So her mom lets her go out for mischief night, but she needs to be back by 9 o'clock, I believe the time was, and that was very strict, and she was taking that seriously because she didn't want to get into more trouble. We know all of this because Martha kept a diary, which she wrote in almost every day, where she talked about her friends and her life. She was pretty boy crazy. She had a boyfriend, but she was also talking to and seeing other guys. She was just a 15-year-old girl. She goes out in the neighborhood with some friends and never comes home.
And this is on Mischief Night, the night before Halloween, putting myself in that time period. Had there been other things going on leading up to this in that town during the time, and any other maybe break-ins or something like that?
Nothing that was publicized. People were so certain that it couldn't have been a member of the community that there was like a long-standing theory that someone wandered off Interstate 95 into the neighborhood, some transient, I believe it was called the transient theory. But that just shows how much of a shock this kind of crime was to the community and how unprepared local law enforcement were, because this wasn't a common thing to happen. So she's missing. Her mom notices, I think she wakes up in the middle of the night. I think she fell asleep painting. As she was falling asleep that night, she heard some excited voices out the window, as she described it. But she woke up. Martha wasn't there. She's very concerned. She sends her son out to go out and look for her, and he does not find her. The next morning, everyone knows that Martha's missing, and people are going over to her parents' home and comforting her mother, who's absolutely distraught. I believe the police are there, and search parties are likely being organized. Martha's friend Sheila lived in the same Bellhaven neighborhood, but their houses, you'd have to like cut through other yards to get to each other. So I believe she was looking for Martha. I bet she heard that Martha was missing. I don't think that her immediate friend group was too concerned at first, because she was a bit wild and 15. So Sheila is walking across the backyard of her friend Martha's house, calling out her name, and then she sees something under a tree that she thought was a mattress, walked closer and realized that it was her friend dead. Unfortunately, she was lying face down. Her pants were pulled down to her ankles, and she had severe head trauma, so there was blood everywhere. When Sheila informed the adults, ran to the house, and the police responded to the scene, they said that they couldn't even tell that she was blonde because of how much blood was everywhere, all over her head and her hair and her clothes. They found a Tony Penna golf club, a women's golf club, broken on the scene. They were later able to match it to a set belonging to a neighbor, but the name on it, on the handle, that was the only part of the golf club that was missing. So, where the name would be, where the fingerprints would be. What remained were pieces of the rest of it, one of which had been stabbed through Martha Moxley's neck. It was a brutal, angry, hateful crime. And an arrest wasn't made for this crime until 2000. So this was a shocking crime to the community, and, talking about it and its heinousness, and honestly, the way that she was left and discovered, it's not that. It reminds me a little bit of the Delphi trial going on right now. Just when you see a young teen killed brutally and then just left outside, it's really disturbing. It outrages the public, and when it goes unsolved, I believe it took 7 years for an arrest to be made in Abby and Libby's case, and much, much longer in Martha's case here. But I can't imagine the unrest that these communities must have felt during that time.
I want to go back just a little bit. You did mention a couple of times that Martha had boyfriends. Maybe she was a little bit on the wild side. Is there any more info on that leads to?
It's a good thread to pull, because so her boyfriend was named Peter, and she had written in her diary about, situations where she had kissed a boy or done things with other boys, and said, "Oh, if Peter found out, he would kill me." She wrote that in her diary. And the night of mischief night, she was at the Skakel house, and you might recognize the name Skakel because Ethel Kennedy's maiden name was Skakel, Ethel Skakel Kennedy, who was the wife of Robert F. Kennedy family. So Ethel Skakel Kennedy's brother Rushton and his children lived in the Skakel home across the street from Martha's home. And she was friends with two of the boys, Michael and Tommy. They were known to just be very out of control as far as their behavior. Their mother had died unexpectedly at a young age from cancer, and it was really traumatic for the family. The father worked all the time and drank a lot. So the kids just did not have a lot of discipline, and they had a lot of trauma. But I'm sure they were a lot of fun to party with. So they were, they had money, they were uninhibited. So they would have parties, and people were over at that house on mischief night. And Martha talked about how it seemed that Michael and Tommy, so Michael's 15, Tommy's 17, both seemed interested in her sexually. And she didn't really acknowledge feeling reciprocity for those feelings. She never said anything negative about the older one, Tommy, but she did call Michael an asshole at one point in her diary. So she's sitting in I believe it's Rushton's vehicle in the driveway of the Skakel house with the Skakel boys. Tommy and Martha get out of the car, and other people from the Skakel family get in the car to go to a different home. It's basically been unknown whether or not Michael stayed behind or went to the cousin's house with them, but this is a crucial time period to account for his whereabouts, because as the car is driving away, Martha and Tommy start kissing and are basically last seen falling together by the bushes onto the ground. And the other friends that were there with Martha felt awkward, so they left. They didn't want to stay around while she's having this escapade. So they leave, and Martha is last seen with Tommy Skakel. And there are mixed accounts as to whether or not, or there have been mixed accounts as to whether or not Michael stayed behind or went 20 minutes north to backcountry Greenwich.
But at this point, Tommy was the last person seen alone with Martha.
So he's a suspect immediately. There's also a live-in tutor, and it was his first day there. He had taken the boys to the golf course earlier in the day where they all drank alcohol to excess, 15, 17-year-old boys. But it speaks to the time, but it also speaks to the privilege. You just don't say no to people if they have enough power, even if they're children. It's kind of amazing to see, but it was his very first day. So people were suspicious of the live-in tutor, but he and Tommy kind of alibied each other because the tutor was upstairs watching a film that was on live cable. So that could be easily time-stamped. And apparently what Tommy's story was that he and Martha separated, she left after they kissed, and he went upstairs and watched the movie with the tutor. So they kind of alibied each other there, saying after she left, he went upstairs and watched that with him. So then Martha crosses the street, and someone hits her in the head from behind with a golf club. She starts to run, but the person catches up to her and continues to beat her, and then they drag her a considerable distance across her yard, and either the pants are pulled down while they're dragging her or they're pulled down intentionally. There is no forensic evidence collected proving that Martha was sexually assaulted. In fact, I believe her hymen was intact.
Do we know why she referred to Michael as an asshole in her diary?
So she described him as being drunk a lot and very volatile once he got drunk, and he had accused her of leading his brother on and was being really nasty about it. And she just said he was being a real asshole. I need to stop going over there. To me, it seemed pretty clear that he had feelings for Martha too, and got jealous when he saw her flirting with him and took it out that way. Okay,
and what is the confirmation that you have about her getting hit in the back of the head while she was crossing the street? Was there some sort of is that a working theory?
I think that's what the evidence at the crime scene reflects. It wasn't a very well secured scene. Dogs were neighborhood dogs were running around sniffing. People were touching the body. It wasn't taped off. I don't think that much of anything was handled properly that day. So I think there could have been a lot of evidence there that just wasn't preserved. But we do see from it that she did make it to her own yard before there's any blood evidence. But you can see the drag marks in the grass, the puddles of blood from the primary and then the secondary attack site.
Okay. And you said that the golf club had been broken. Is it assumed that was broken while the person was hitting her with it, or was it broken intentionally to get rid of the part that had the name?
It is assumed that the force being used by the killer was so great that it broke on impact.
I'm not a golfer. I don't really handle golf clubs, but I can't imagine how hard you have to be hitting something to break a golf club.
It was like a maniacal, animalistic attack. Whoever did this is an animal. Autopsy photos were described, and it's horrifying what was done to that child.
And can you remind me again on the ages of everybody?
Martha was 15 when she was killed. So she was, I believe, a sophomore or a junior at Greenwich High School. And Michael Skakel was 15, so the same age. But he and Tommy, who was 17, they both went to a private school called Brunswick. So they didn't actually go to school with Martha, but they knew her from the neighborhood. If you're not familiar by now, I am telling the story of Martha Moxley.
And we'll be right back after a quick word from our sponsors.
Thanks to our sponsors, and now we're back to the program. She wasn't missing very long, less than a day, but it took a long time for developments in this case, 25 years. What happened during that time? Was there a suspect? Were there rumblings in town of residents who thought they knew who did this?
The community and the police both heavily suspected Tommy Skakel. And in the beginning, his father was very cooperative. Like, he let them into the home. They didn't need a search warrant. They just, searched as they pleased, basically. And then they wanted to request school files and things like that. And the dad had just kind of shut the whole thing down and shut off any access, got a lawyer, and even hired his own private investigator to try to rule his sons out, which unfortunately for him wasn't the outcome of his private investigation. So the police in the community strongly suspect either Tommy or the tutor. Smaller groups of people suspect Michael, but it's accepted at this point that he went with his cousins and is therefore alibied. And so if he wasn't in the area, then he couldn't have done it. They have a idea of what time she was killed because dogs were barking in a way that was unusual for the neighborhood dogs to be barking. So clearly something was going on. And if he went with them, then he couldn't have done it. But a huge stall with the way that the Greenwich police blundered the crime scene in the initial days of the investigation. And some thought that I don't know if the right word is starstruck, but at least the idea is that they were influenced in their investigation by the Skakels' influence and money. All these years pass, and I don't know if you remember the name Dominic Dunn, but he's a famous journalist who chronicled famous trials like the O.J. Simpson trial, and he was a real talking head at that time. He started to do research on the case because he wanted to write a fictional book based on it called Season in Purgatory, which was it's a very good read, but it's based on the Martha Moxley case. And someone gives him a copy of what's now known as the Sutton Report, which was the private investigation group that Rushton Skakel had hired to look into the case. And I guess this person was like an intern at the time, so he wasn't sworn to confidentiality. And I'm not sure if it was directly given to Dominic Dunn or if it was given to someone else who then gave it to Dominic Dunn, but someone leaked it and had a lot of new information about Tommy and Michael that made them both look suspicious, changing their story about what they did, about times, about where they were. Then later Michael is trying to write a book, like a tell-all book about the Kennedys called Dead Man Talking, A Kennedy Cousin Comes Clean. It never was published, but his ghostwriter had a bunch of recordings of Michael talking, sharing his stories. And one of his stories was about the night of the murder of Martha Moxley. He says that he had made a date with her in the car, went to the cousin's house, went back, and decided to do some window peeping in the neighborhood. He went and checked out a house where he knew of a woman that liked to hang out in the nude. And then he said, Martha likes me. I'll get a kiss from Martha. So he climbs a tree outside of Martha Moxley's house, claims that he calls her name. No one answers. So naturally he masturbates to orgasm and then gets off of the tree. And as he's walking home, he senses a presence under the tree. So he picks up a stick and yells and says, get the fuck out of here, and runs home.
Wait, under the tree that he was previously perched in? So he gets out of the tree after doing his business and realizes that there's somebody else there?
Senses a presence, fears that someone's there in the darkness. Okay. Felt like a vibe. I don't know if he actually saw someone, but this is all what he told the ghostwriter, which is obviously nothing that he had ever admitted to before.
Right.
Was this something that he did often, like peeping into people's windows?
According to him, yes.
I guess he doesn't realize how big of a red flag that is.
I don't think so. I think certain people do things and just assume that they're normal. I mean, he must have known. There was a lot of information about the case that came out because Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who's his first cousin, and now, he's still on the ballot, but former independent candidate because he did, I guess, drop out. And if Trump wins, future Trump admin, he wrote a book called Framed, how Michael Skakel spent 10 years in prison for a crime he didn't commit. So spoiler alert, Michael Skakel, I'm sure we all saw where that was going. Once the Sutton report and the ghostwriter interview came out, Michael Skakel was arrested in 2000 and did serve about 10 years in prison and was convicted of the crime.
What was the damning evidence that sent him to prison?
The recording of what he had told his ghostwriter was presented by the prosecution as a way for him to account for potential forensic evidence being found on the body. Perhaps there was some sort of sexual assault or some sort of masturbation over the body after the crime. And during the time where the Sutton associates were investigating the case and when he was writing his book, DNA was advancing. So both he and Tommy both told stories that basically would make it so their semen could be accounted for on or near the body, because Tommy had originally said that they kissed and then parted ways, but then he said that they, engaged in sexual activity in the news story to the Sutton associates. So it's a very circumstantial case. They really don't have any forensic evidence against Michael Skakel at all. They have that tape. They have a bunch of accounts from classmates at the reformatory school he was sent to that say that he confessed to killing her to a bunch of people, which, he says is not true. It wasn't a very strong case against him.
Right. And tell us a little bit more about the Sutton Associates. That's the private detective agency that was hired by the Skakels.
Correct.
What? And you mentioned earlier that it didn't. Their investigation didn't really work out favorably for the Skakels. Can you tell us why or what they ended up finding?
So their investigation questioned whether or not Michael really did go to his cousin's house that night and poked holes in his alibi. They had given sodium pentothal or something to his siblings, and some of them said that Michael wasn't there. So they presented that in court too by saying that the only people that alibi him are his family. And it's not all that consistent. It also showed the changed stories because they interviewed Michael and Tommy and mentioned the development of DNA science and identifying people. And so they both changed their stories in that report. And the report profiled the likely offender, and they said that the person was in their early teens, lived in the neighborhood, had a pattern of window peeping, had an alcohol problem, had romantic spurned feelings toward the victim, had an anger problem. It fit Michael very well. But that's not, just because someone fits a criminal profile, that's not a bullseye as far as I'm concerned. So the case against him was pretty weak. And later on, his conviction was overturned with advocacy from RFK Jr., who said that the prosecutor used unfair tactics. Like he used the recording from the ghostwriter where he said when Dorothy, Martha's mother, came the next morning to his home looking for Martha, he said, and I thought to myself, oh shit, what if someone saw me last night, referring to the masturbation. But he uses this recording over an image of Martha's dead body that's, disrobed and bloody and horrifying. So Michael Skakel's new lawyer and RFK Jr. said that was very prejudicial. And they also said that his own representation, Mickey Sherman, was not adequate counsel, so that he didn't have, his rights were violated because he had insufficient counsel. There was someone who wasn't a Skakel family member that was at the cousin's house that night that did say that Michael was there, and he never married into the family. He was just a completely separate individual that remembers seeing and speaking to Michael during that time of death. And the attorney didn't call him. So there were a few things that a judge agreed went wrong in the case. His conviction was overturned, but he was still charged. But then after several years, it was decided that Connecticut would not retry Michael Skakel. So he's free, and the case remains unsolved.
Crazy. So he spent 10 years in prison and then was released. His murder conviction vacated, I guess. What about Tommy? Any suspicion on him or the authorities had moved past Tommy at this point?
I don't know if the authorities are really going to do much of anything more in this case. Like, I don't think they're now going, let's go back to the drawing board. I think they're saying we're not going to pursue a speculative case. Perhaps if something were to like show up on their doorstep, they would do something, but it doesn't seem like they're actively looking for the real killer. I feel like the attitude is probably more like we found the real killer and now he's free because the case wasn't strong enough or because counsel wasn't competent enough. I believe this whole case, and obviously it's no comparison to how Martha's life was destroyed, but the reputation of Michael and Tommy is ruined. They are both ashamed of who they are. Michael's son even changed his last name to his mother's last name, and which Michael supported because he doesn't want his son to be embarrassed of who he is.
Wow, sounds like a lot of power dynamics going on between the Kennedys and the Skakels and the court system. Is this something that you agree with? Is this influenced by the power of the Kennedys?
What's really funny is I really scoffed when I first read the description of RFK's book, because his claim was that Michael was discriminated against for being associated with the Kennedys and that they were just out to get a Kennedy. And I was like, come on. Our system is incredibly biased, but it's usually the other way, where they're biased against the poor and the disadvantaged and not the super rich and well-connected. They definitely were very motivated to make an arrest. And there was community pressure and media pressure was intense at a national and international level. But I don't think that the government was committed to convicting a Kennedy cousin at all costs just because of who he was. I think that maybe some people in the media might have felt that way, but not necessarily the state.
Yeah, I mean, you'd have to get into real conspiratorial territory and bring up like JFK's assassination and the whole, and blame the government and all that stuff. So I agree. I don't think that's anywhere near the reality.
Yeah, it's an interesting argument to make. Poor rich white guy. This is because he's a rich white guy. He's being discriminated against.
Yeah, I can see the Kennedy media bias a little bit, because mentioning Kennedys in newspapers and magazines, that moves newspapers and magazines, and then obviously even today with digital stuff, it would still work today. Same
Absolutely.
formula. Yeah.
It's kind of like the same old playbook. It sells. So I think his point about the media is absolutely correct. But I didn't see, I read the whole thing. I didn't really see any evidence that he was framed like the title of the book suggests. But I do think that certain people in the media push a narrative.
Yeah, everybody loves a good Kennedy tragedy, right? That's the news when it comes to the Kennedys, as opposed to something good.
Been happening for decades. Yeah.
Absolutely.
And wait a second, Chloe, did you just say that you read all of RFK Jr.'s book?
I listened to it in the car.
Case? Is that what I heard?
I listened to it a few months ago.
Okay.
I'm not going to get political, but so while I thought he has some very strange, contrarian, conspiracy-rooted ideas, I was still interested in hearing the entire breadth of his argument. I wanted to see what his case was. He's a compelling speaker and an attorney, and he brought up a lot of good points about media bias and the shoddy investigation. I didn't really approve of him naming two black boys as potential suspects without really any evidence besides hearsay.
Was there a large population in that town of Black individuals?
No. Even now, today, Greenwich has a much more diverse populace, but back then it was still very much a predominantly white community. Fairfield County in general. Even when I was a kid, I grew up in Fairfield County in a community pretty similar to Greenwich, and there were maybe 2 students in my high school that weren't white, and they weren't from our town. They were from a different town. So it's it wasn't a lot of people. It wasn't a large community back then. And the two boys that are accused of this by RFK weren't actually from Greenwich. They were from New York City and apparently had traveled to Greenwich to go to Mischief Night. They were friends with a boy named Tony Bryant, who's related to the basketball player Kobe Bryant. And they were with him that night. They said they wanted to get a girl caveman style. And the theory is that they picked up the clubs from the Skakel home, which, by the way, the golf clubs belonged to the late mother of Michael and Tommy Skakel, Anne Skakel. But apparently the theory is that sometimes the golf clubs were just left out and they picked them up, saw Martha, happened by her, and attacked her, is the theory by RFK. So apparently, according to Tony, he didn't come forward with this story until much, much later, because when he told his mother about it, she told him to stay out of it because she was concerned about him getting blamed due to racism in the police department, because Tony Bryant's black too.
And he named them like by name in his book?
Yes, first and last names.
Wow. Was there any repercussion on that? Because that's like coming up with a theory and saying it happened, like now you have to try to prove that wrong. That was just like imagined. And you're going against all of I know it's circumstantial evidence, but it's the family's golf clubs. It's issues that Martha was having with people she was calling assholes, and he would kill me. Like, how is that not the like, where's the framing happening here? And
Yeah.
were there any repercussions on naming them?
No, they, I think, made comments that they're innocent to the media, but they don't have the resources to sue a Kennedy. And I believe RFK knows this. He's a lawyer. He knew the risk of a defamation of character or libel suit, but probably weighed that out. Like, hey, these guys don't have a lot of money. They're really going to go against me. He also, in the book, badmouthed Martha's boyfriend, Peter, said that he was really volatile, and also even badmouthed Martha's older brother, and, was saying things that made him potentially suspicious. So he was really just kind of, the book was a defense for Michael, and it was, taking all of the alleys that a lawyer could have taken to defend him. But when you're looking realistically, a defense attorney isn't going to say, it could have been this guy or this guy or this guy or this guy or this guy. They usually have a cohesive story of who they think it is if they are presenting an alternate suspect defense.
And we'll be right back after a quick word from our sponsors.
Thanks to our sponsors, and now we're back to the program.
So what about Martha's parents? What was their involvement as this was all playing out and into the arrest and the conviction and then the overturning of the decision?
Her parents were very active in advocating for the investigation to come to a conclusion. They were very communicative with the media, with law enforcement. Eventually, Martha's father died of a heart attack before the case was solved. So Dorothy, his widow, had to, kind of face it all alone. But even in her older age, she didn't give up and made sure to advocate for her daughter through the end. And she's still alive.
And still advocating.
She was asked how she felt about Michael being released, and she made it very clear that she still thinks that it was him, but is feeling at peace that he has served time and is not pursuing any more action. I think she just wants to be in peace now.
But so he only served about 10 years and now he's free. And do we know what he's up to now?
I believe he lives in upstate New York or Fairfield County. I know that he was staying with his brother at certain points. Like, I think when he was first freed, he had to stay in Connecticut, but his son was in New York. So yeah, he had a son that was a child when he went to jail. So he missed his son's entire childhood. And his life probably isn't great. I think he has a relationship with his son now, but I don't think he's married. He's very overweight. He doesn't look very healthy. His reputation is bad. He can't get probably the career that he had hoped for as a child. And everybody hates him because they think he's a murderer. And we don't know for sure whether or not he is.
Did he commit any other crimes in his adulthood? Like violent crimes like that? Like, because it strikes me like a peeping Tom, whether that's a lie or not. But he made it seem like peeping Tom was okay. So I'm kind of thinking like that was in his arsenal of things that he did. I don't know. It just strikes me as maybe this is someone who would have acted again.
He wasn't arrested for any violent crime. He got a DWI and totaled a car with a female passenger and was absolutely drunk and high, which, so he was reckless, but there was nothing like of him attacking people or stalking people. No.
My goodness. This is quite a story that kind of doesn't have a conclusion. How are we feeling about that? I mean, are we feeling okay that somebody could have committed this crime and been convicted and then did time and then was released and that's good enough? Is that justice?
It's a complicated question because this is something that I think consumers of true crime experience is you follow a case, you care about a case, someone is tried for the case and you're watching it, like with the Delphi case, and you can have your opinions of their innocence or their guilt, but it's about what the prosecution can bring and convince a jury of. And it's hard when you're not really sure if that person's guilty, if you're not really sure if they deserve to be in jail. It's all of the unknown is hard until we know for sure what happened to Martha, which we may never will. We may never actually get that whole story because there is no forensic evidence uncovered here. So unless someone confesses or otherwise new information comes out, we won't really know. But until that hypothetical day, we won't know if Michael Skakel was wrongfully convicted and missed his son's childhood for nothing.
And what about Tommy? Anything else on Tommy since the crime?
He's also kept a low profile, not a big like internet presence or public presence, but he married and had children and I believe moved to Massachusetts.
Wow, Chloe. Yeah, this is a very interesting case with a lot of twists and turns. Yeah, I almost can't believe that that the conviction was overturned, but I do understand the points that there just isn't a lot of evidence there.
Not enough, anyway. And I don't know them anymore, but I knew someone who was on the jury. I didn't know them while they were on the jury, but I found out later researching the case. And Melina actually saw them and asked her about it. And she said, he's disgusting. About Michael. She goes, the whole thing was disgusting. I hated every second of it. And Melina said, so, like, are you sure he's guilty? And she said, I wouldn't have convicted him if I wasn't.
Wow, that's amazing. So that's directly from one of the 12 jurors' mouths there about why they convicted him. That's pretty incredible.
It is, but when you think about she sounded so sure. But that answer almost highlights RFK's thesis, which is that the public was so disgusted and horrified by the crime itself, and then the way that Michael was depicted. They were disgusted by the peeping Tom behavior, the brash way he talked about public masturbation, maybe resented him for being spoiled or rich or privileged, who knows, but it's an emotional response rather than saying, oh, it was so clear. Like this, that, and this made it so I was 100% sure of his guilt. He's disgusting. And I hated every second of it.
Wow. Well, I wasn't sure what you were going to bring to the table today. And you, once again, hit a home run, knocked it out of the proverbial ballpark. Can't thank you enough for educating Tim and I on this, very tragic Halloween murder, this very gruesome Halloween murder.
It's a horrible crime. I wish there were answers. I think we all hate when there's no answers. And these are real people who deserved a lot better for themselves and their families. So I do hold out hope that maybe we will know for absolute sure one day.